Introduce now Katerina Fotopoulou. She's a PhD and a professor of psychodynamic neuroscience at University College London, leading research on the mental-physical health interface, including the European Research Council program grants Bodily Self and MetaBody. Fotopoulou has received several awards for her research, including the Distinguished Young Scientist Award in 2014 by the World Economic Forum and the Early Career Award of the International Neuropsychology Society in 2016. She is co-founder and treasurer of the International Association for the Study of Affective Touch, board member of the European Society for Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience, and co-editor of the volume From the Couch to the Lab, Trends in Psychodynamic Neuroscience, published by Oxford Press in 2012.
Thank you. I guess this is my cue. I'm delighted to be here and for this invitation to take part in this clearly fascinating event on a very contemporary yet paradoxical topic to be having an online meeting on. And we're going to change gear a little bit because I am a psychologist, a psychotherapist, a neuroscientist, not an artist or technically part of the humanities. But I do want to talk about touch, and I think a topic that literally cuts across some of the things that we've been discussing today. But I will approach it from a sort of a bit more empirical, more scientific point of view. So every year, museums, when they can be open, have to repair the damage caused to exhibits by visitors touching them. Why would people want to touch objects that they can clearly see? And what is it that touch therefore provides that vision does not? And by extension, what does this physical contact add to our visually rich digital communications? There are many answers to this question, but I want to emphasize three embodied possibilities that make touch, I think, effectively, emotionally special for humans. The first is at the very beginning, and it's the fact that humans are born into another, with the first sense to develop being touch. Human infant in the womb first responds to tactile stimulation before it can actually see or hear and respond to these kind of stimulation. And even after we are born, more than any other of our fellow mammals, we are unable to move purposely and fully by ourselves for a long time. That means we cannot get to the fridge and grab something to eat, nor do we know how to thermoregulate. So we need to be fed and held and hugged, and we need all of this or we die. So evolution has made sure that we don't die, and it has also made sure that, you know, we prolong the species, we explore different food sources, and therefore we develop a big brain to do that, but a brain that starts small, and it's literally held by others in development to develop bigger and bigger and more clever. So some of our dualist Descartesian friends may like to talk about the constitution of the self as being a lot about cognition and intelligence and thought, but the reality is that it's also a lot about mothering and being dependent and being in care that is mediated by touch. And evolution has made sure that when we are babies, each single one of us in our development, this happens again and again and again. In other terms, we stay with our conspecifics. We have therefore developed, according to the attachment theory, a drive, a fundamental embodied need to be close to others and to be taken care of by others. And because evolution is conservative, it likes to use one mechanism to achieve many things and therefore save energy. It has used a much older system the pain system to make sure that we stay close to our caregivers. So in brief terms, social separation hurts. Social rejection, even in adulthood, hurts. If somebody, as we just heard in this video, even being on the phone, where the absence as well as the presence of the other person becomes acute, that can hurt, that can be unbearable. So that's the second serious fact about touch and softness and social proximity. And increasingly, we understand in science that as social separation hurts, social touch and social contact may actually heal. So early parental or later peer or partner touch is found again and again in the lab, even in humans, even by us using neuroimaging methods, for example, to reduce pain and stress, to be able to increase positive emotions, not just pleasure, but the communication of things like praise, appreciation. So these are some things we've learned about touch. It affects starts early, it's important to us, and if we miss it, it hurts, and if we get it, it heals. And actually we know that from animals, both in the lab and in the wild. So observing or allowing animals to be cared by conspecific or to play in a very physical, touchy-feely way versus isolating animals and not allowing them to have this tactile context makes a huge difference to both their psychological, for example, what we mean by psychological these animals is the mechanisms by which they can feel anxiety. So this is better if they've had touch, and it's devastating if they didn't have touch. And similarly to their physical health. So animals growing up without touch will die sooner and will ail more, they'll be more sick. And we've seen in the wild that this not only mediates mechanism in the particular generation that we're testing, but it also literally changes how certain genes, things that are inherited, are actually expressing themselves in ontogeny. So these are deep mechanisms, and it seems that touch really affects them. And we've seen a little bit of that in the lab with humans, so that tactile interactions between mothers and infants translate to physiological interactions between the two bodies, literally heartbeats being synchronized. And that translates in certain affect regulations, so certain emotional mechanisms in the infant being regulated differently in sync with their mother versus out of sync with their mother. So from touch all the way to conscious and unconscious mechanisms of dealing with emotions, we've been able to study in animals and in humans in the lab. However, studying this in the wild for humans is obviously not possible. We can only study it in extreme cases of trauma, particularly in early life, when, for example, somebody is growing up in war conditions or something equivalent, which obviously as a scientist you never wish or control, and the kind of information we therefore mainly relies in studies we've done in the lab. But from that point of view, the social and physical distancing that COVID-19 measures enforced on most of our societies has been a great, unwanted, but still a great experiment. So we all heard about flattening the line and other slogans from our governments to stay away from our beloved ones. And it has taken that for us to do it. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. And as we just heard, yes, there is Zoom. Yes, we are being able to organize these kind of events from distance. But this comes at the price. And the price is that we have mediated social distance, but it is not physical distance. So at the time of the first lockdown in the UK, we were running together with the Wellcome Trust collection and Goldsmiths University, one of the biggest touch surveys in the UK with around 38,000 participants. 80% of them were from the UK, and interestingly, 70% of them were women. So what we've learned first from this research is that more women are willing to fill in surveys. Average age was about 55 years, and lockdown just hit. So progressively, the UK went to some kind of fear and therefore social distancing to absolute 100% lockdown. And then 40 days later, we run a second smaller survey to see differences, including a lot of people in the UK, but also other countries in Europe and Latin America. Again, 70% women, and about, on average, 10 years younger, the second sample. So suddenly, in the midst of unprecedented adult physical distancing, we have these two surveys on touch. So we can start seeing, does it matter in the wild? So first, just to give you an idea of what I just said, so we're asking how much touch hunger have people experienced, and these are from 4 to 14, all the weeks of the survey. You see that at the bottom of this graph, and you see here week 12 is when social distancing measures start to be implemented at the governmental level, and full lockdown comes at week 14. And you see this huge shift from week 13 to 14th in how much hunger people perceive. This is here a clear sample, reliable responses of 18,000 people. So that little difference there is actually a big difference and significant all the way. Zooming in and a little bit later, so suddenly we're very aware that we're missing touch, but now a few more weeks have passed. We are now on average at about 25 days of lockdown. What kind of touch are we missing? So this graph shows you first on the left, how much touch either intimate in red or friendly in blue or professional in gray had people had before. So the week before the lockdown, and you see that there is this nice gradation. The second graph is how much you've had last week. So what we see here is that intimate touch is reduced, but not as dramatically as the other touches. And that's why, because people live sometimes with their families or other close intimate others. So we have a drastic reduction, though, in friendly touch and, of course, professional touch. And then the last graph is how much touch you wanted, where you see here the fact that even though you're having, on average, quite a bit of intimate touch, still people want more intimate touch, either because they're the ones that are not getting it, or because intimate touch may not be the same if it's only with the same people in the household. And then, of course, people really acutely crave for friendly touch and less so professional touch, but a little bit of an increase there. And we're also noticing that the more days somebody has been practicing social distancing, because there's one thing the measures and one thing what you actually do, the more intimate touch is what is desired, whereas friendly touch seems to stay flat. If you wanted it a lot in the beginning, you're going to continue to want it a lot, and vice versa. And what are the effects of this kind of lack and desires on our mental health? So how did our touch experience and lack thereof affect various aspects of our mental health? So we see here that intimate in yellow, the more intimate, so not friendly and not professional, this was not statistically significant, touch experienced in the past week, the less the anxiety, the loneliness, and the better the general mental health and our subjective sense of our tolerance of isolation. So basically, if you feel you have enough intimate touch in your life during lockdown, you're feeling less stressed and less lonely. It seems quite obvious, but we didn't know before, and psychologists like to prove the obvious. And that's obviously controlling for other things that may be affecting us. So these findings is just giving us an insight to, I guess, thoughts that we all have during lockdown, but in a more systematic way, about the long term, the insights we've had from animal and lab studies regarding the important touch, the important role of touch in social bonding, affect regulation. But what about if we really can't? What about have physical interaction? What about the people that live alone? Are they any beneficial substitutes to touch? So we are also neuroscientists, so we looked at neuroscience and we looked at how does the brain help us feel touch by just seeing touch. So indeed, watching a movie with some disgusting object crawling on your body or somebody being hurt, we tend to have a very embodied reaction. It is as though we feel the touch we see on where our body is. So this is called vicarious touch. And indeed, it relies on a history of tradition initiated by Vittorio Gallese and his colleagues of the so-called mirror neuron systems in the brain. But the idea here is that when we see touch, some of the brain areas that process feeling touch are also activated. And that applies also, we know in more recent years, to affective touch, to touch that is particularly that the body interprets as pleasant, pro-social touch. So seeing it also gives you some of the same sensations and feelings and brain responses as feeling it. So could we use that, we wondered, during lockdown as a kind of buffer of the stress and loneliness some people were feeling? So we tried it in 3 ways. We created pleasant pro-social videos of human-to-human touch, human-to-pet touch, or human-to-robot touch. And we played that via a computer. So all that people had was a visual stimulus, a video of various of these kind of interactions. And then they rated their emotions before and after. So this is a graph on their anxiety. So they had to rate at the beginning of our survey how their anxiety, then a lot of questions, then they see the videos, and then they rate how they feel. And it seems that the videos are overall reducing the anxiety. So seeing touch has an effect in the moment in how you feel. And interestingly, the more lonely you feel and the more you have been lacking touch due to lockdown in your life, the bigger this effect, the more the effect of seeing these kind of videos. Interestingly, if we compare between them, the human-to-human touch works well. The pet, human-to-pet, is absolutely the best. And we've had various of these kind of findings in the lab as well, when we allowed people to bring their pets in versus a friend. And the pet downregulates physical pain more than a friend, holding your hand, for example. And interestingly, seeing human-to-robot touch had less of an effect. Awkwardness and other such feelings seem to be mediating this effect. And interestingly, we also asked if people would consider this as a substitute to touch, and we see pretty much the same thing. Pets are the best and robots are the worst. So this kind of vicarious or seeing touch, especially of human-pet interaction, seems to, in the moment, calm and reduce anxiety, particularly when you're feeling particularly lacking touch and lonely, and particularly, of course, in these restricted and strange times. However, seeing human-robot touch was not as desired. So what are our attitudes in this period more generally about digitally mediated touch? Could we provide some actual tactile feedback or stimulus, even if the rest of the communication is done digitally? So most of our mobile phone communication, our internet chats like today, our exchange of social feedback like likes and smileys and all that, rely on visual and auditory cues. Yet, if you look at the studies that looked at social communication and they look at the kind of emotions that are communicated between people and what kind of modalities people prefer for these kinds of communications, touch is the one most preferred for the communication of pro-social emotions and intentions, particularly affective touch. So this kind of findings have led to a late but final interest in the so-called affective haptics and related areas of human-computer interaction, soft robotics, etc. This is academically, so if you do a search on these kind of fields for studies of this kind, you see that from 10 years ago, there's a massive increase in the amount of scientists, technologists, engineers, academics who are interested in studying this possibility. And indeed, soft robotics as well, so developing the kind of robots or machines or cuddly, fluffy, helpful devices that can either give you touch or communicate touch via somebody else somewhere else intending to touch you, are on the rise and they're increasingly studied. And they take the kind of forms you see here. And for example, if we look at affective haptics, you go from having your screen like this to having a little device like that that you can actually kiss, and that kisses your boyfriend in a long distance relationship. Or you can have on your phone, you can have a device that you can touch and tap and vibrate, etc. And then your partner, your communicative partner at another country or continent will have a similar thing, so that as you are, for example, trying to communicate your support for them losing their job, you may send them a tactile message instead of just a visual message. And tactile sleeves is another way of doing it, where you're wearing something where somebody else's emotions are communicated through the sleeve to you. Let's say because somebody else is in a stressful job interview and they're sharing their anxiety with you so that they know you know, and hopefully you care. So these are the kind of technologies that people have been playing with. There's nothing that's become as widespread as, let's say, Instagram or Facebook, but certainly there's a lot of interest and a lot of possibility. And we did our own some years with various colleagues here at UCL, where we call them the connecting mittens, where there are two soft mittens where you can put your hand and then send another person in some distance different kind of modalities to communicate different kind of emotions and situations. And we also tried it to see what happens if you set up a sort of Twitter-like interaction where people can communicate news, and instead of getting an emoticon that is like that, or a smiley or a sad face, you are getting tactile emoticons. So you're getting via these kind of haptings like the mittens, you're getting either highly pleasant touch or just neutral touch. And these are some preliminary results. So on the left, you're seeing the optimal touch, really communicating strong prosocial emotions versus a more neutral touch. And similarly for comparison with visual emoticon, a very very clear emoticon and a not so clear positive emoticon. And you see that people do report some support via emoticons, but the tactile ones, particularly the optimal one, seem to have a stronger effect in communicating this. But what about in the wild? Okay, this is good when you develop all these prototypes, but do people like this kind of thing? In these surveys during COVID, we also had questions about that. So we've sampled a little bit people's attitudes to use these kind of devices to send instant messages, to send their mood to somebody else, send a hug, do a handshake, and also add touch into virtual reality environments. And as you can see from this very colorful graph, it really depends on the person with, for example, in terms of sending hugs, 20% saying absolutely not, and only 12% saying totally. So everybody else is kind of in the middle. Interestingly, though, if we go back and look at the effect of time, as the lockdown progresses, we see that people's attitudes towards this kind of mediated touch changes. And people are now, 14th week, when the lockdown starts, much more willing to actually give those a try for some of these social communication goals. So to conclude, physical isolation has an added effect to social distancing, with intimate touch being the the most craved and the most therapeutic of digital stress and loneliness. But also seeing touch, especially seeing human-pet interactions, somewhat paradoxically does some of the work for us, particularly in the lonely, and particularly as I presented in the beginning, evolution seems to like to combine its methods to cause beneficial effects for our well-being. However, of course, not everybody is ready for other substitutes and use of technology, but COVID-19 seems to be increasing our willingness to try out at least some things. And we've been trying to understand in the lab, going beyond our colleagues, engineers and technologists and psychologists and neuroscience, what would determine our changed attitude and our explorations to these kinds of digital mediated technologies, so that digital doesn't have to be the trauma, but maybe digital is opening up to all sorts of other playful, exploratory, and maybe supportive opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you to Professor Fotopoulou, who just presented remote but not distant possibilities and tensions of digital contact comfort. Proximal interpersonal space is the space of bodily contact, but also the space of social interactive possibilities. The physical space in which others can touch our skin, and the imaginary space in which others can touch our emotions. Touch acquired a new resonance in the era of social distancing, reminding us the well-studied role of contact comfort in development, relatedness, and health. In her talk, Fotopoulou just explored data collected during the pandemic on the mental health effects of unprecedented touch deprivation in human adults, as well as survey and experimental insights on experiences and attitudes to digital remote touch technology for mediating physical remoteness and social communication.